Find the derivative of g of x equals the cosine of x sine x, then evaluate g prime of pi over 2. G of x here is the cosine of an entire expression, x sine x. And therefore, when we take the derivative, we're going to have to make use of the chain rule for the inside, the derivative of the inside. Now, the inside of the cosine is x times sine x. It happens to be a product, and therefore the derivative of the inside will require the product rule. The derivative, g prime of x, will start with the derivative of the outermost function. That's the cosine. The derivative of cosine is negative sine. You leave its entire inside alone, x times the sine of x. And then we multiply by the derivative of the inside for the chain rule. The derivative of the inside is a product rule, x times sine x. The derivative of the first derivative of x is a 1 times the second left alone, sine x, plus the first left alone, x, times the derivative of the second derivative of sine is cosine of x. Now I'm going to rewrite g prime of x by moving this expression out front with the negative, and I'll use parentheses instead of square brackets. 1 times sine x is sine x plus x cosine x. The reason I wrote those first is those trig functions are a little smaller than the other one. The other one is the sine of the entire quantity x sine of x. And it's customary to put the smaller trig functions first and then the bigger ones later. So there's our derivative g prime of x. The next thing to do is evaluate g prime of pi over 2, which means to plug in a pi over 2 in for each of these x's. We will have negative sine of pi over 2 plus pi over 2 cosine of pi over 2 times the sine of pi over 2 times sine of pi over 2. So we have the negative of, now the sine of pi over 2 is a 1 plus pi over 2, and the cosine of pi over 2 is a 0. And then we have the sine of pi over 2 times the sine of pi over 2, which is a 1, so it's pi over 2 times 1 inside of that other sign. And this is now equal to a negative, we have a 1, and then plus pi over 2 times 0 will just be a 0. And then pi over 2 times 1 is a pi over 2, so we have negative of 1 plus 0, which is 1, and then times the sine of pi over 2, which is a 1. 1 times 1 is a 1, and we end up with negative 1.